Welcome to the Rebel Health Coach Podcast with Tom Underwood. Armed with truth and knowledge, your journey to a healthy lifestyle can be obtained. Preventative wellness, quality nourishment, and daily fitness routines dramatically improve your outlook on life as a whole. And you'll find the support and info you need to accomplish a healthier lifestyle here. Together, we can empower each other along our journey to an amazing you.
Welcome to the Rebel Health Coach Podcast on this new year of 2019. First of all, I'd like to say Happy New Year, and I hope everybody had a great holiday season and a great New Year's Eve. I wanted to start the year out with an episode regarding gut health because I am a firm believer in the fact that all disease begins in the gut. And gut health is imperative to our overall health. So today I'm joined by Dr. Rachel Lovink. Dr. Rachel Lovink is a naturopathic physician who studied at the Boucher Institute of Naturopathic Medicine. She is in Victoria, British Columbia, and her specialties include mental health services, including anxiety and depression, ADHD, bipolar disorder, declining cognitive function, and mood swings. She also specializes in hormonal health and gut health related problems such as gas, bloating, GERD, and reflux, constipation and diarrhea, gastric ulcers, infections, SIBO, H. pylori, IBS, and IBD, or Crohn's. And today's topic is your gut making you depressed? I hope you enjoy the show, and I wish you a very, very, very happy New Year.
Today, I'd like to welcome Dr. Rachel Lovink to the Rebel Health Coach Podcast. Thank you for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
Before we get started into the gut and depression and anxiousness, why don't you tell the listeners about yourself and where you studied and how you got into this realm of naturopathic medicine?
So I'm a naturopathic doctor. I'm here in Victoria, BC, which is in Canada. And I studied at the Boucher Institute of Naturopathic Medicine. So that's one of two schools that we have down here in Canada, the rest being down in the States. And graduated in 2016 and essentially have been practicing here in Victoria since. So for me, my journey with naturopathic medicine probably started when I was really young. I was sort of raised that way. My mom didn't really ever take us to allopathic doctors. You know, she would take us to the local herbalist or to some energy healer. So I just sort of grew up with that background. But, you know, really what pushed me into naturopathic medicine was sort of my own health journey, which, you know, is probably very common among us naturopathic physicians and also for allopathic doctors. But I think more commonly you'll hear the story with naturopathic doctors. So that was essentially my turning point in my career, which I had done sort of several careers before getting to this one, was my own health journey and having this sort of breakthrough. So yeah, I can get into that. As a young, adult, I, was working in the restaurant industry. So not eating really well, not sleeping really well, probably drinking too much alcohol, not excessively, but more than probably was good for my body. And sort of started developing both gut symptoms. So, I sort of had what the classical IBS stuff going on, whether it was gas and bloating or, altered, stool. So, constipation and diarrhea. And, of course, this is always, hindsight, and I can tell this story very chronologically because I can see it now. But so for me, that was happening. And then of course, my mood started slipping. So I started, experiencing a lot more anxiety, low moods, and these would sort of alter. And, I sort of hit my breaking point when I had a panic attack at a meeting with the company I was working for at the time. And that's just sort of threw me into a tailspin of, for anybody who's had a panic attack, they know that what follows is sort of this fear of having another one. So this kind of set me down this path of a lot of anxiety, mixed in with depression. And then of course, all these gut symptoms that came up. So, to make a really long story short, I sort of hit the rock bottom where I didn't know what else to do. And so I went to a doctor's office, and, within 5 minutes of being in the doctor's office, I was walked out of the office holding a prescription for an antidepressant. And, aside from the fact that I was, was sort of confused and didn't think I was depressed, even though I was experiencing low mood and anxiety, I just intuitively knew it wasn't right. And so I sat with that antidepressant for a week before I actually decided to take it. And I did, because I was desperate and I didn't know what else to do. And within a week of taking the antidepressant, I just started getting all these side effects. My sleep got worse. My anxiety actually got worse. And so my instinct was just to stop it. And so I stopped it. And of course, things just got worse. And this was sort of my rock bottom. And it was right around Christmas time. And I had, ironically gotten a book from my brother. And the book is called Clean. And it's by an author called Alejandro Younger, however you want to say that. This I sort of see as my saving grace, because I ended up grabbing the book and, really gravitating towards it. And I read it. And the book is really about essentially just cleaning up your diet, cleaning up your environment, cleaning up what you're exposed to. And so you do this, I did a 6-week program with this Clean, and completely eliminated my anxiety and depression and all of my gut symptoms. I, to this day, don't think I've ever felt that level of happiness and waking up just feeling incredible every day, because it's really hard to commit to a 6 weeks program. But so that was sort of my aha moment where I said, oh my gosh, this is real medicine, healing my body based on just what I was putting in it. And so this was my inspiration to sort of look into, well, there's something to this. And that led me to naturopathic medicine, where, the core of what we believe is that everybody and everybody's body has the ability to heal itself. And so healing comes from within. So.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So that's where the mood and anxiety focus became more prevalent.
Totally. Yeah. I mean, okay. When you've experienced something yourself, you have a lot of ability to be compassionate towards that, particular condition.
Right.
And the inspiration and the intuitive knowledge that can be fixed. I'm not saying everybody's anxiety and depression is caused by the same thing, because it's not. But, my own experience with it really taught me that there's something beneath, a lifestyle approach to it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. And mood and anxiety disorders today are more prevalent than ever.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, well, first of all, we eat a lot of junk.
Yeah.
And second of all, I mean, we all work a lot of hours, and people get stressed out. They don't do a lot of self-care.
It's very true. And what we'll dig into today is really that, mood and anxiety disorders are multifactorial in their cause. But ultimately, there's a lot of dysfunctions in the body, whether it's hormonal, whether it's nutrients, that can mimic or cause these symptoms of anxiety and depression. And so that's really the important piece of how we approach anxiety and depression, is not, slapping a medication on people that are experiencing these symptoms, but rather doing the investigative work to figure out what's going on, what's the imbalance, why is the body responding in this way? And so that's sort of how I've approached all my patients. And the other part is that, mood and anxiety always come as a part of most conditions. So people come in with gut we'll walk into my office and I have gas and bloating. There's always a mood component to that. So that just sort of tells us that connection. People coming in with thyroid disorders, well, there's usually a mood component to that, whether it's depression. We know hypothyroidism is linked to depression. So, that's, I guess my point in saying that is that the body's linked. It's not, it doesn't operate in compartments. It interacts in the different organs, and our different tissues interact with one another. So we have to approach healing in this way.
Okay. All right. Let's dig into the gut a little bit. We always hear the phrases like, I have butterflies in my stomach, I have a gut feeling, or that there's a pit in my stomach. And, I'm a firm believer in the gut-brain connection, or that. And I know Hippocrates was an old gentleman. He was 200 BC. He said the gut, all disease begins in the gut. So he's a very brilliant man.
Right.
Let's talk about that. What does the gut have to do with how we feel?
Right. So, I mean, a few important pieces here, but when we think about the gut, a lot of people don't realize that the gut actually has its own nervous system. So it is lined with nervous systems, cells and parts that, are part of the greater nervous system of our body. So that's important for us to know, because how we feel is largely mediated by our nervous system, but also it is mediated by hormones and neurotransmitters, which actually the gut produces a lot of its own hormones and neurotransmitters. So things like serotonin, dopamine, epinephrine, all these things that we know are related to mood. Well, guess what? The gut also produces those. So those two components there can tell us that how we feel, what happens in our gut can impact how we feel. And then the other component to this is that we know that our gut is lined with a microbial population, and these microbes, so these good gut bacteria, influence our immune response. And so our immune response is very much tied into inflammation. And so what we'll learn later on is the role that inflammation plays in brain health and in mood disorders, which is a really important piece. So yeah, and I will also just mention that, typically when we think about the gut function, we think about how the brain influences the gut, right? So the brain controls motility, it controls the secretion of important, products of digestion, so our enzymes. But actually what, we've learned, and I'm sure a lot of your listeners know, is that actually the gut influences the brain as well. And this is called the bidirectional communication between the brain and the gut. So yes, the brain influences the gut, but the gut and its contents and what happens there has a large influence and communicates with the brain. So this is really important because it tells us that we can make a big impact on our brain health and our mood health by impacting what's going on in the gut.
Okay, good. Okay. And the role between the gut plays with the mood and anxiety also. Can you expand on that just a little bit before we dig deeper? Yeah.
So, I mean, if we just basically really just talk about what the gut does, this will give us a lot of insight into understanding how it can impact the brain. So when we look at its function, so it's involved in the absorption and breakdown of nutrients. And this includes a lot of the precursors to our important neurotransmitters and hormones. And if we're not properly breaking down and absorbing nutrients, guess what we're also not making? So it also communicates and educates the immune system. And as I mentioned, this is plays a big role in our inflammatory response in our body, which is sort of thought to be at the root of most chronic modern diseases, which include mood disorders such as depression. It's a protection, a barrier between the inside and the outside. So it prevents toxins, it prevents undigested food particles, it prevents unwanted bacteria and other substances, viruses from essentially entering into our bloodstream and interfering with our immune system, our nervous system, and our hormone system. So that's really important, its role in protecting. But it also not just absorbs and breaks down nutrients, but a lot of the bacteria in our gut produce important nutrients, neurotransmitters, and hormones. And this includes things such as B12, serotonin, GABA, norepinephrine, and dopamine. And these all play a really critical role in mood regulation. And I'll just give your listeners a few examples, is that, for example, lactobacillus, which is a known species that inhabits the gut, produces acetylcholine and GABA. Okay, and GABA is one of our sort of calming, sedative type neurotransmitters. The bifido species produces GABA as well. And the streptococcus and the enterococcus, which are also normal inhabitants of our gut, produce serotonin. So all of these are really important for brain health. So, what we put into the gut and how it impacts that bacterial population and the function of our gut goes a long way to impacting our brain and mood. I hope that answers your questions.
Yep. Now, here's a big issue I see is that allopathic medicine model on treating this is usually done by handing out a prescription just as you were handed.
Right.
Or for a proton pump inhibitor or something to reduce the serotonin. It actually has a downward spiral effect. Could you go into that a little bit?
Yeah. Well, really, I just want to take a step back and just kind of talk about, the old model of how we treat mental illnesses and what we've now learned. So under this conventional model of treating mental illnesses, the primary concern is to treat the symptoms. So, for example, we give an antidepressant,
Right.
and this is to decrease the symptoms of depression. Well, depression is a symptom, exactly that. It's not in the way I treat a disease in and of itself. And so based on this model of chemical imbalance, where we're giving something like a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor, which increases, supposedly increases levels of serotonin in a patient, is sort of misguided, because the research actually shows that this approach, so this chemical imbalance in our brain model is faulty for several reasons. Well, one is that studies have shown that when we reduce levels of these neurotransmitters, so norepinephrine, serotonin, dopamine, it doesn't actually reliably reproduce depression in humans. Also, that some depressions actually have low levels of these neurotransmitters. And then again, some depressed patients actually have high levels. So there's really an inconsistency in this chemical approach. So again, we might have to consider that depression is not a neurotransmitter problem, but instead, an accumulation of symptoms that are caused by downstream somewhere else in the body. So the other, sort of thing that we want to think about when we talk about anxiety and depression is that we want to investigate what the root cause is. We want to know what's downstream, what's causing these symptoms. Because if we think about things like common symptoms that people experience with anxiety and depression, so let's just take depression, for example, there's often a fatigue, there's lack of motivation, there's difficulty thinking, there might be insomnia, there might be changes in appetite or weight. And these symptoms in and of themselves can be caused by many other dysfunctions in the body. And I'll just give you a few examples. So, anemia can cause these same list of symptoms. Thyroid disorders can cause these same symptoms. Nutritional deficiencies like not enough B12 can cause this symptom. And even hormonal, so sex hormone imbalances, so estrogen or progesterone or testosterone imbalances can all cause these same symptoms. So when we have someone that walks into my office and is saying, I'm tired, I can't think straight, I can't sleep, I ask why, because that's really important, because what the underlying processes that are causing these is where we have to address mood disorders and how we can really provide relief for these patients instead of, slapping them with a pill that really isn't fixing much, except for providing potentially some temporary relief.
Temporary relief. Yeah, I did say proton pump inhibitor. It's a SSRI. I messed that up a little bit. I don't know why I had that written down here.
The proton pump inhibitors? Well, that can impact mood too, right? Because pump inhibitors inhibit our ability to break down food. And as I mentioned, that's a really important part of, brain health, is having the right things that feed into.
Right. All right. So let's dig into what the harm of not getting to the root cause is. I mean, we know that some of these medications are temporary relief, and sometimes they're necessary.
Yeah.
And what is some of the harm of not getting to the root cause of this problem in the gut?
Right. So for me, that's kind of twofold. One is that individuals who have mood disorders, whether it's anxiety, depression, are more likely to engage in unhealthy lifestyle behaviors. So things like drinking, smoking, eating poorly, lack of exercise, that's, sort of a risk factor. So if we're not actually addressing the behavioral component or what's lying beneath it, we're actually increasing their risk for other chronic illnesses. But the more important piece, which I think you're asking, is, if we don't address this root cause, well, I guess what is the root cause? And what we're starting to learn, and especially in depression, is that inflammation is sort of one of the key pathological processes that can occur in depressed patients. And this is a really important piece to consider, because inflammation is actually can cause many other dysfunctions in the body. And now research is showing that it's actually at the root of most modern chronic diseases. So if we're not actually addressing this inflammation, not only may we have patients who have mood disorders, but we may also have patients who may develop diabetes, may develop other cardiovascular conditions, may develop cancer because of this inflammatory component. So we have to go after the root cause, which is inflammation, if we truly want our patients to get better, and if we truly want our patients to have longevity and enjoy life, right?
Right. Let's dig into inflammation, since that is a lot to do with, the gut health, and you've talked about that a little bit, but let's dig into what does inflammation have to do specifically with our brain? Because when people think of inflammation, we think of a cut and it inflames, or a broken bone where it inflames, but nobody thinks about the gut and the brain connection with inflammation.
Yeah.
Or not a lot of people do.
Right. So yeah, it's good for people to sort of make that link there. It's great that you brought that up. Is, externally, inflammation looks like exactly what you said. When we stub our toe, when we burn our hand, it's that red hot swollen sensation. And we can sort of allude to that in terms of what happens in the body too. And the problem, sort of just to jump ahead for a second, is that when this happens in the brain, and we will explain sort of how this ends up happening in the brain, is that actually the brain doesn't have pain sensors. So while we can feel inflammation externally when we burn ourselves, we actually don't feel it in the brain. But instead, what happens is a bunch of chemical changes that lead to these mood problems, which I'll get into in a moment. But so, if we talk about inflammation and we're talking about it on a gut level, well, as I kind of started talking about at the beginning, is the immune system, the gut is lined with the nervous system, but it actually houses 80% of our immune system. Okay, so when we're exposing our gut to toxins, to foods that maybe we're allergic to bacteria and viruses that are not, endogenous to our gut, when we're constantly stressed out, all these things provoke an immune response. And it really comes down to actually our bacteria population. They're sort of considered the educators to the immune system. So when we are exposing our gut, and therefore our microbes that are in our gut, to elements that they're reacting to, this sets off an inflammatory and an immune response, not just in the gut, but also in the body, because of the role that these bacteria play in educating our immune response. So let's just take, for example, a patient who is consuming, let's just say, corn, for example. And not everyone's allergic to corn, but let's sort of assume that we know this patient is let me not say allergic, is sensitive to corn. Eating that corn product, what happens is that your microbes sort of consider this food to be a toxic or foreign substance, and educate. So it sort of sets off an immune response in the cells that line the gut. And this immune response, therefore, releases a bunch of cytokines and other messaging molecules that are at the root of sort of this inflammatory process that then goes elsewhere in the body. So this is kind of a basic kind of explanation of what happens in the gut and how it reaches the immune system, and then how this immune system causes inflammation that goes elsewhere in the body, and in the context of this conversation, eventually reaches the brain.
Okay.
So, well, I know we'll probably get into a little bit about the leaky gut, but this inflammatory process that happens in the gut because of all these things we're being exposed to changes the microbial population, which therefore you don't have that same protective mechanism, because these microbes are really play a really big protective role. But also with chronic inflammation in the gut, we also get a breakdown of our gut lining. Okay. And so this gut lining is sort of like a skin-like tissue in your gut. So all the way from your mouth down to your rectum. And it's sort of a barrier between the inside and the outside world. But with chronic inflammation, we actually get a breakdown of that skin-like layer. And you can sort of think of it as a sieve instead of it being a wall. And so food particles and, potentially external bacteria are able to leak through and cause a secondary immune response. So now things are not staying in the gut as they should. They're now getting into systemic circulation and causing another immune response, which triggers another inflammatory response.
Yeah. So I like to think of the leaky gut as a pair of nylons, and you rip a hole in it and stuff starts to show.
Exactly.
But things leak out of it.
Yeah. That's a very good analogy. The gut lining is very selective in terms of what it lets through, but you're right, as we expose it to inflammation, it's not able to do that same kind of selective response in terms of what gets in and what gets out. Yeah.
And now for some general housekeeping. First things first, if you enjoyed this episode, please take a minute, go into your app and rate and review this show. Then share it with your friends. This would mean the world to me. Next up, to join my mailing list for newsletters and other emails, text RHCP, Rebel Health Coach Podcast, RHCP to 22828. Again, text RHCP to 22828. I promise not to send you endless emails. Believe me, who has the time for that? Now, to grab a free 20-minute consultation with me, go to my website, and on the homepage, at the bottom is a red button that says Book Now. Click it and schedule your consultation with me. I will have you fill out an intake form so that during our consultation, we can discuss what I can do for you and also see if we are a good fit to work together. You can find the link in the show notes also. Thank you and enjoy the rest of the episode. Before we get into the leaky gut in more detail, which I really want to do because that's what causes a lot of this, is let's take a closer look at the gut and take us through a top-down view.
Right.
For the listeners.
Yeah, and that's important because I don't think people understand all the different parts of our gut and how they are all connected. So I like to really explain it very simplistically to my patients. I say, think of a hollow tube, okay? And so this is essentially what our gut is. It's a hollow tube, starts in our mouth and ends in our rectum. And it's a very consistent lining of hollow tube that goes down. If we break it down into its individual components, we have the esophagus, and then we have the stomach, and then we have the small intestine, and then we have the large intestine, and then finally our rectum. And so this hollow tube, while simple in its structure, as we've already talked about, is actually quite complex in its function. But for the purposes of explaining, this hollow tube is a skin-like layer, as we talked about, which is our gut lining. And on the inside, and just so listeners know, when we talk about the inside of your gut, we actually consider that to be the external world. So that's why this gut lining plays such an important role, because anything that's in your gut is still considered to be in part of the external world. It's only once your body and your gut body's microbes have decided, and this is in a healthy individual, that these substances are safe to enter into your body, does it actually able to get across the gut lining. So I like to explain that inside the gut wall, inside the gut is still external to the world. And so on top of this, hollow tube, so the skin-like layer, which we call our gut barrier, we have a mucus lining, we have microvilli that play a role in digestion and absorption. And then importantly, we have all of our gut microbes. And we literally have microbes that are all the way, that are in our mouth and that are all the way down into our large intestine. And the number of them is really where they differ. So when we talk about our healthy microbial population, yes, to some degree, we're talking about the stomach and we're talking about the small intestine, but mostly we talk about the large intestine because this is where the majority of our microbes reside. And essentially, when we talk about the small intestine, it's relatively sterile. So the numbers of bacteria in this part of our gut are closer to 1,000, whereas in our large intestine, they're millions and billions. I might be misquoting myself here. But so that's really important to consider. So the health and the population and the balance of these bacteria that line and that are in each individual compartment of our gut play a really big role in how our gut functions. So I'm sure some of your listeners have heard about SIBO, which is small intestinal bowel overgrowth. That's where we have too much bacteria in a part of our gut where we shouldn't have it. And that's in the small bowel. Another infection that we can talk about is H. pylori. Well, that's an infection that happens in the stomach. And this is when this population is able to thrive because usually it's related to not enough stomach acid. So I'm just sort of giving your listeners some examples of the different microbial populations that inhabit different parts of our gut.
Okay, since you just said stomach acid,
yes,
let's go into that a little bit because a lot of people have a misconception of when they have acid reflux, they have too much stomach acid, and that's a misconception that even gets played out on TV commercials.
Right. Yeah. And so, stomach acid, I guess to answer your question, yes, it is a misconception because the symptoms of the symptoms of reflux and heartburn that commonly are associated with too much acid can be caused by both too much acid, but also by not enough stomach acid. And, I don't have the number of percentages here, but I'll tell you from my own anecdotal and clinical experience and in reading, research that supports this is that more often than not, patients have not enough stomach acid. And this can be confusing for people, but the underlying factor here is that stomach acid actually causes the closing of our lower esophageal sphincter. So remember that the compartments, our gut is compartmentalized, and we have our esophagus and then we have our stomach, and we have valves essentially that keep the contents of the stomach from essentially splashing up into our esophagus because the contents of the stomach are very acidic. But when we don't have enough stomach acid, this lower esophageal sphincter can open slightly or not close enough. And so what happens is we get regurgitation of food, or we may get, acid that splashes up. And this is sort of just a simple, explanation of it. Other things,
right,
underlying that. But yeah, so when a person comes into my office and, complains of reflux and GERD, I'll first investigate what is causing this. So is it stress? Is it, are they on, actually, ironically enough, a proton pump inhibitor? Do they have infection, H. pylori being one of the most common ones? So, that's sort of the stomach acid debate. But, with that being said, there are some patients who do produce too much stomach acid, but those are the minority rather than the majority. Yeah. And so
all right,
a quick way, so I'll just say for people, the quick way to distinguish this is actually people who have hypochloremia, so not enough stomach acid, they get put on a proton pump inhibitor. Typically, their symptoms won't resolve completely because stomach acid, too much stomach acid is not the problem. So sometimes it can be, a differentiator. But anyways, we always sort of investigate what's causing this.
All right, let's dig into the leaky gut just before we get into some other protocols. And I want to talk about E. coli for a minute because E. coli gets a lot of bad rap. But let's dig into leaky gut. And what are some of the causes of leaky gut? We all hear about gluten.
Right. So there's many causes and gluten, it does get a bad rap, and I'm not anti-gluten by any means. I certainly do test for celiac, and I'll test for food sensitivities to the proteins that are in gluten. But there's two reasons why if people are having gut problems and or mood problems, I usually take this guy out to begin with. And that's because for two reasons. One, gluten is literally in everything. And so there is something to the saying, that too much of a good thing is bad. So, if we, go grocery shopping and we'll look at the box of all the labels, typically there'll be some form of gluten in the majority of packaged goods that we buy. So whenever our body's gut and therefore immune system is overexposed to food substances, this sort of can be a predisposing factor to immune reactivity and therefore inflammation. So, I like to eliminate as many variables as possible. So typically I'll say, let's keep gluten out. And secondly is that gluten is actually, when we think about the foods that contain gluten, it typically includes things like pasta and breads and pastries. And so inherently by removing gluten, we're typically, taking these guys out. So it sort of just sets us off on a better eating dietary plan to begin with, which, sort of fits into our model of treating mood disorders. So in terms of it being a gut disruptor, that sort of depends on whether a patient is celiac or not has non-celiac gluten sensitivity. And these are two different things. So to differentiate, celiac is an autoimmune disease that damages the small intestine and actually interferes with the absorption of important nutrients. And we can readily identify this for the most part through lab testing. So if you're suspicious of it, definitely ask your doctor to check for celiac. And even if, if you have any kind of gut disruptions and you eat gluten and you're not, dying or keeling over, I would still test for it just to rule out. But then the other, gluten sensitivity is the non-celiac. And so this is also an immune response. We don't understand it quite as well, but we certainly know that in these individuals, consuming gluten causes fairly immediate symptoms. And so these are sort of a separate class of patients that for sure gluten's a non-negotiable with taking it out of the diet.
What about GMOs?
So GMOs, are genetically modified organisms. And one of to understand sort of why I typically suggest people take these out is because in order to, the reason we create genetically modified organisms is essentially so that they are resistant to herbicides and pesticides, right? This improves the farmer's crop. Well, one of the herbicides and pesticides that they genetically modify it to be resistant to is something we call glyphosate, it's more commonly known as Roundup. And you just type that guy into your Google Scholar and you will come up with numerous studies that show the impacts that glyphosate and Roundup have, not just on gut health, but also on our hormonal health and the production of important things such as serotonin and vitamin D. It's known to disrupt with that because it's considered an endocrine disruptor. So that's a really big reason why when I talk about GMOs, it's got quite a buzzword around it. And I just say, stick to the clean 15 and dirty dozen. And those are two very readily searchable items on the internet. And they're essentially a list of foods that are typically glyphosate free. So that would be your clean 15. And then your dirty dozens are the ones that are usually quite heavily sprayed with glyphosate. So you definitely want to avoid those. And that list does change typically year by year. So make sure when you're looking at it, you're looking at the current years.
Yeah, I'll put a link in the show notes at ewg.org.
Yeah. And just so that listeners know, two of the most common GMO foods are corn and soy. So if you're going to consume these foods and your immune system's able to tolerate them, these are like absolute, make sure they're organic and non-GMO.
It's hard to get organic corn anymore, or soy for that matter.
I don't eat corn, so you're right. I don't really know, but
it's very hard to get either soy and corn that's non-GMO. Let's talk about something that a lot of people don't think about, and is stress. And this is one that is personal to me because I have a tendency to go hard in the gym and stress my body out and stress my adrenals out, and it usually has a downstream effect of my gut.
Right. So, yeah, go ahead.
I mean, and we're also in a stressful time of year.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Christmas time.
Yep.
Gotta buy all those presents. navigate the malls. I call it dodging people at the mall.
Dodging people.
Could be actually a fun game.
It can be
you embrace it.
I don't have any dodging to do on Amazon.com.
Oh, so. Right. That's the era that we're in. It's so funny. Yeah. My partner and actually we're talking about that. We haven't done our Christmas shopping and we said, well, we can just order it all on Amazon. So funny, the world we live in now. Yeah.
Yeah.
Ironically, I might end up doing that.
Yeah. I like Etsy too. If we're going to.
Oh, yeah. That's a good one. That's a good idea.
Yeah.
Well, therefore, yeah. So, managing your stress and if online shopping is a way that you can manage your stress, that's going to take you a long way with healing your gut. So, yeah, we'll dig into that. So, we already talked about the connection between your gut and the nervous system, right? So your gut is lined with nervous system cells. And so when we think about stress, what if we just sort of divide up the body's stress response, we have our sympathetic and our parasympathetic, okay? So our sympathetic is sort of our fight or flight. So it's what happens when our boss yells at us, when we have a deadline coming up. As you mentioned, exercise can be a form of stress on the body. So it sort of is that part of our nervous system that gets us up and going. And when we're in this sympathetic state, what happens is that our body's resources and blood gets diverted to organs that are really important to executing functions in that area. So that includes our brain, that includes our muscles, and that includes our heart and our lungs primarily. So all of our body's resources go to these parts of our body in order to enable us to run and to execute those functions. And this happens at the detriment of our gut and our sex organ functions primarily. So the opposite of our sympathetic is our parasympathetic. And this is our rest and digest, as it says. And so in this state, our body's blood and resources come to our gut. They come to our sex organs that enable those parts of our bodies to operate efficiently. So when we're chronically stressed, and that can be in many different forms, that's one thing I always highlight to people. The most obvious forms of stress are those acute stressors. So as I mentioned, deadlines at work, stress in a relationship, driving in traffic. Those are we know we're stressed in those situations. But some of the more subtle stressors, which have the same impact on our nervous system, but we may not be quite as aware of, is things like food sensitivities, things like infections, things like too much exercise. And that's a big one I talk to patients about. I have patients who come in who are doing HIIT 5 days a week. And that's great in that your body's getting all toned up, but what that is also doing is that is increasing and perpetuating a cortisol and a sympathetic nervous system response in our body, which if we're already stressed and we're already struggling, this can sort of be to your detriment rather than to your gain physically. So I'm just sort of trying to explain that stress can come in many different forms, and it impacts our gut because when we're in a sympathetic state, our body's not able to digest and break down nutrients, and it's not the motility of our gut is not happening, which sort of propagates this this dysfunction and this inability or improper breakdown of nutrients, which can lead to fermentation in our gut, which creates gas and bloating. When we have lowered motility, so constipation. Again, food is able to ferment and therefore feed certain populations over others and leads to an imbalanced gut flora. But also, stress just in and of itself, the increased production of cortisol in and of itself propagates an inflammatory response. So this just sort of sums up why stress is such an important component of addressing gut health.
And then we have antibiotics on top of that.
Right. So, that's, pretty simple, and the antibiotics are anti-life. And so, antibiotics can be incredibly useful in certain situations when we need to, preserve function, and they can be very life-saving, but they're far too commonly prescribed. And so, when we kill our microbial population, we get a dysfunction in our gut. But also, there's hidden sources of antibiotics. So antibiotics can be in our water sometimes, depending on where you live, but more commonly in our meats. So that's really important to be aware of, is that you're having a lot of meat, so especially red meat and poultry, to make sure you're buying antibiotic-free meats, because this is also a source of gut killing. And also, right. Yeah, so that sort of explains it.
Yep. I want to talk about, before we dive into how we fix this, E. coli gets a bad rap because, especially now with the lettuce or the romaine, the romaine lettuce have just been all over the news. So that's why it came to my mind is E. coli.
Right.
But E. coli is not bad.
And that's, the thing with all bacteria is E. coli is actually a natural resident of our gut microbial population. And this is such a key point, is that it really comes down to balance, right? So we have, I don't even know the number of species of bacteria in our gut, E. coli being one of them. And as long as we're maintaining the balance of bacteria, we're maintaining a healthy immune response, and we're maintaining the function of our gut. It's when certain populations are able to thrive over others that we get dysfunction. And so, when you talk about the E. coli scare with romaine, we're taking doses of E. coli from our foods, which is not necessarily beneficial. But then again, depending on the health of your gut, some people are not impacted by that, and others who may have not as healthy of a gut population are more prone to having to those infections.
Okay, let's dig into the 4 R's and how do we fix this? Okay, we have a leaky gut, or we have gut problems, we have anxiety, we have depression. How do we fix this?
Right. So, the 4 R's essentially is a structural framework that, most of us naturopathic physicians use to treat the gut. And that's first and foremost is remove. So this is sort of a key component, and can sometimes take up the largest portion of our treatment protocol, is actually removing the barriers to health. So we can be taking, eating all the best foods in the world and, taking the best supplements. But if we have an infection in our gut that is, going unabated or unchecked, all of our good work is not going to get very far. Same thing with chronic stress. If we have chronic stress all the time, we're not able to get our body into that parasympathetic state. We could be taking all the best food in the world, but guess what we're not doing? We're not breaking it down and absorbing it. So that's why the first R is such an important component, which is remove the barriers to health. The second one is replace. So replace systems or parts of the digestive tract that are not working properly. So typically that involves replacing with digestive enzymes, which is usually a key component of anybody who has gut, is just to sort of help the body along to break down those the food that we're eating. The third one is remove, replace, reinoculate. Right. So reinoculate, which is giving probiotics. So reinocculating with good, healthy bacteria. And it's really important that we choose the type of bacteria and the type of probiotics we're giving very carefully. And quality does matter in this area. And then the last part is repair. And so this is sort of the last stage typically, where we repair that gut lining. And this includes things like L-glutamine, which is used by the enterocytes of our large intestine and small intestine as a food source. So it helps to propagate their recovery. It can include things that are sort of healing to the gut lining. So this can be things like DGL, slippery elm, some important fibers which help to feed the good bacteria. So these are prebiotic fibers. So there's many different, ways to repair, but typically, this is sort of a last stage that we do in the 4 R's.
Okay. Let's do this now. Before we go, what do you have to add to this that you'd like to tell the listeners as far as the anxiety, depression, and the gut?
Well, first and foremost is, to sort of listen to your gut. So for anyone who's struggling with any mood disorders, the gut is such a fundamental place to start. And really the reason is that it's the source, it's our source of food and fuel for our brain. And so if we're not feeding ourselves and not making sure the food we're actually consuming is actually getting broken down and integrated into our body, we're really, taking any steps we're taking forward is going to be step back, because we're not able to produce those healthy neurotransmitters and hormones. But also, listen to your gut, because it always will sort of tell you when things are off. And so if we have gas and bloating, if we have constipation, diarrhea, reflux, any of these symptoms is sort of our body's way of telling us to pay attention, to kind of tune back in. And this is a great sort of place to start if we want to start correcting mood disorders. And that's, largely related to this immune and inflammatory component that our gut plays in overall brain health. So.
Okay. Awesome. Well, let's ask you a question here now. And I ask this of all my guests. If Rachel has an hour to a half an hour to kill, which we all know time's a commodity.
Yeah.
What would you listen to? Group or album or any, as far as music wise?
It's such a tough one because it's Christmas now. So Christmas music. Usually I rotate, through some type of jazz is kind of my go-to. Who's one of my favorite artists right now? I love Ben Howard. Let's stick with that one. Ben Howard.
Ben Howard. Okay.
Yeah, he's a great artist, and he's really chill and great steady music, or, having a bath kind of music.
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah.
I want to thank you so much for coming back to join me today. And I guess the listeners don't know about that, but the last time we recorded this, I forgot to push record.
Yeah.
So
we had a practice run.
We had a practice run. I thank you so much for really coming back. I'm so grateful for you. And I hope you have a very Merry Christmas.
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be on here.
Thank you for joining in today with the Rebel Health Coach, Tom Underwood. And be sure to subscribe to the show so you can catch all the episodes. With desire and commitment, you can implement a lifestyle of wellness and fitness. For the support, encouragement, and tools you need to be successful, visit tomunderwood.net.